I'm not interested why it's not possible, and I showed him the door. The next morning I got a telephone call from him. He said, I was never so badly mistreated like by you. I said, sir, I really apologize, but you know, you put me in a very awkward position here as Commander KFOR. If we cannot deliver any goods to the local population, we become an occupation army with all the negative trends. Afterwards, he tried to help and he helped. But much more important was the President of the United States, who came about a week later. And again, he said he wanted to help me. And I said, I need money. And his question was, how much is it? And I told him, I need $500 million US. That's enough for run Kosovo for a year. He said, that's a lot of money. I said, no, sir. With all respect, I contradict. You know, NATO bombarded Serbia and Kosovo for 78 days. Every day costed NATO $1 billion US. If you give me a half day of those 78 days, I can run Kosovo for an entire year. He turned to his security advisor, Sandy Berger, and said, make sure General Reinhardt has the money by the end of the week. And I got the money, Senator, looking to the former politician. I was very, very much impressed by this president who really knew how to run politics. Just another very short story. Some of the elders might remember that we also introduced the Deutschmark into that country against the will of the United Nations and all other nations. But the Deutschmark was the normal currency. Dinar, nobody was working with the dinar. So Bernhard Kushner and myself, we decided, let's get the Deutschmark. And the question was how to get the money, I mean the currency, from Germany into Kosovo. It was no problem to fly them by transport aircraft into Skopje, but it was a problem to get it from Skopje into Pristina, because we were afraid that some bad guys might get a hold of that and steal the money. So we said we fly it in by our helicopters. And then I got a telephone call by my Minister of Defense, German Minister of Defense. And he didn't say, hello, General Reinhardt, how are you? He said, I'm very disappointed about you, Jim. You are involved in illegal actions. I said, sir, I don't understand anything of what you're saying. He said, you know exactly what you're doing. You basically supported this introduction of the German mark into the market. And this is illegal because by doing this, you break Kosovo out of the economic circle of Serbia. And you even use German helicopters, which you are not entitled as a NATO general. You have to ask me, because you are now in a position not as a German general, but as a NATO general, and I will not allow this. So you stop this immediately. What are you going to do then? You know, I did what every recruit normally would do. I said, yes, sir, and I continued to use the helicopters because there was no other place. One of the biggest problems in management and peace support operation like this is time. You don't have enough time. I spend about 85% of every day in non-military activities, being in our provisional parliament, being in the interim administration, being with the United Nations Security Council people, going to New York, being with those 4 pillars, having visitors all over the place. You know, if you imagine that in 7 months I had 1,300 and more visitors, and they all wanted to see KFOR, not a staff officer. And they all had to be treated accordingly. And a lot of you colleagues came in here. And I said the only one whom we did not see by that time was the Pope, because he had no troops here, and Putin. But we had the Russian Minister of Defense, Sergeyev, and the German Minister of Defense, and Mrs. the lady who was responsible for helping, for asking us to help her in digging up the mass graves. She was very, very impressive. And we had to give interviews. Because before I left, I was told by Secretary Robertson, General Reinhardt, one of the most important things you have to do is go to the public and basically inform them what you're doing. So I went public when we started off here, and we gave interviews, local interviews with the Russians, with the Serbians, and the most important addressees in our information campaign in this regard were the capitals of the troop contribution nations. If you don't get their agreement to what you're doing, if you cannot persuade them that what we are doing is correct and is all right, then they pull their forces out and then you stay there. And nobody will help you. So the press policy and the information campaign going with that was I think one of our best weapon system which we could employ here. And I needed to have time to talk to the local population. Going to the families who invited me, whether they were Albanian or Turkish or Serb families, talking to the people and talking to my soldiers, explaining to them what they were supposed to do and why we did what we did. And it's not always good to have only the battalion and the brigade commander. They want to hear it from this horse's mouth. And I was trying to be as much as possible with them. Humanitarian aid was not our key mission. But all these kids to get out of those terrible tent villages into an environment where they could survive in wintertime and don't freeze and don't starve up in the mountains, where we basically had our logistical support in most of the villages by helicopters because of this many snow, no car would get there. And we were very proud, I cannot tell you how much, that nobody starved to death, nobody froze to death in this very, very cold and difficult winter. And my soldiers did a tremendous job. I had 50,000 soldiers, all colors of the face, all religions which you can imagine, totally different doctrines, and everybody told me, General Reinhardt, this is not possible to command and control them. They were totally wrong. All these kids, 18, 17, 18, 19-year-old kids, were eager to do something for you people here to improve the situation in Kosovo. And the Russians looked at the Americans and they said, if the Americans do it, we'll do it the same way. This was like a military Olympic Games somehow, that they all looked at each other, and we had not only NATO countries, 17 NATO countries, and you can imagine, if you make your calculation, that there were another 12 non-NATO nations, included the United Arab Republic. You see here King Abdullah from Jordan, who had his special forces here, and the Sheikh of the United Arab Republic. We had Brits and Germans, and the first time even the Swiss company participating, and I had 4 Russian battalions, and these Russian kids wanted to be as good NATO soldiers as anybody else. It was important for them to visit them and to tell them how good they were. And I had a deputy, a 3-star Russian general with whom I never had any problems. The problems I had, that all the nations had 2 totally different rules of engagement. You should know that there's a solution for the rules of engagement, how far we can do and what we can do in our operations, which has been laid down by NATO. The NAC, the NATO Council, decides upon that. But every nation comes into a country like this with a different political intention. And they are not official. But you suddenly realize that this nation says, I don't do this, and we're not allowed to do that. And the only way to check it was that I moved from every nation elements into Mitrovica to see how far they would go. And our American friends were there with the company for a half day, and then they were pulled out, and I was called by Secretary of Defense Cohen, telling me I'm not supposed to move every American soldier anymore, because there were some Serbs with snowballs, throwing snowballs at the Americans. And CNN made this a very bad story, and the president saw that, and he said no casualties. And other nations very similar, saying we go to North Mitrovica, but not to South Mitrovica, but not in no risk. I don't say no fun. Officially, all these forces were operational control to me. Operational control means I can give them orders for a certain limited time and for a certain limited change as far as the operation area is concerned. In reality, they were perhaps up tomorrow, because whenever they got something which was out of the normality, they called the capital, asked them, are we allowed to do that? It was very difficult, but in the end I knew of every contingent, how far I could go, and then you can work with this puzzle, but it's very difficult. What I could not prevent were unilateral force reductions. Suddenly the Dutch, and then the Canadians, and then the Belgians said, sorry, we have to consolidate our forces in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I started with 50,000. By the end, when I left the country, I had 32,000. The other 18,000 were just gone. But my mission has not changed. And we just have to know that a group like NATO countries or United Nations countries is a group of sovereign countries. And if they say, that's it, we're pulling out, as the Dutch and the Canadians do right now in Afghanistan, you cannot do anything about it. It only creates problems for you as a commander. So, ladies and gentlemen, it was amazing for me how motivated our soldiers were, no matter what nation, and how much they were willing to contribute to the well-being of the Kosovars. And they did things they would never do back home in the garrisons without complaining. And they had no Sunday, they had no girlfriend, they had worked every day in the week for 6 months without any intermission. We had 2 trouble spots. In Arben, the first trouble spot was not to be solved. This was Mitrovica, with the Ibar separating the country, with 90% of unemployment in northern Mitrovica, and people demonstrating almost every day about the situation. We wanted to change that situation. We had fantastic plans, but you need also somebody to help you in executing those plans. And if this is a political solution for a country, not to put more pressure on the local population, then that's it, what you can do. Another thing was the problem with some of the elder ones might remember, this was the problem of insurgents in the zone of